The wax is still tacky if you press too hard. Not fresh, nothing in AD 1518 is fresh now, but preserved in the way panic preserves fingerprints. A city ordinance scroll from Strasbourg sits on the table like a severed limb, ribbon, seal, greasy edges where too many anxious hands have worried it. And the order written inside is the kind that makes you blink twice. Hire musicians. Build a stage. Encourage them to dance. Not for festival. Not for triumph. For sickness. Because the city is watching its people dance themselves toward collapse, and the government chooses, of all things, music as a weapon. If that sounds insane, stay close. Because it is also terrifyingly logical. It is midsummer in Strasbourg, a dense city in the Holy Roman Empire, timbered houses leaning inward as if they're listening. Heat pools in the narrow streets. The air tastes of river damp and old smoke. You can smell grain dust from the markets. Bread is life, bread is politics, and beneath it, the faint sour note of too many bodies too close together. The bell of the cathedral measures time the way a blade measures distance, not comforting, but exact. And there, in a street where commerce should be moving, a woman begins to dance. Later accounts will give us a name, Frau Troffea, though even that is a kind of historical gamble, a tag pin to a moving target. But the first fact isn't her name. The first fact is motion. Not the controlled steps of a guild celebration. Not the flirtation of a tavern. This is grinding, compulsive movement, the kind that looks like it's happening to her rather than being chosen by her. Shoes scuff. Breath snatches. The skin shines with sweat that won't cool. People stop carrying baskets. A carter slows his horse. Someone laughs, because the mind reaches for humor before it reaches for fear. Then the laughter thins out, because she doesn't stop. Now picture the war room, because Strasbourg has one even if it doesn't call it that. A council chamber where magistrates, men trained in law, in negotiation, in the careful arithmetic of order, measure risk the way merchants measure cloth. With them, guild leaders, worried about labor and public calm. Physicians educated in Galenic humoral theory, who speak in the language of heat, bile, balance. Clergy who speak in the language of sin, saints, and punishment. And outside those walls, the poor, people already running on narrowed margins, scarcity, anxiety, bodies made brittle by hunger and worry. Everyone has something to lose. And the clock is ruthless, every hour, more dancers, more collapses, more whispers that the city is cursed. Here is the objective, stated plainly as any military order: stop the dancing before it becomes riot, heresy, or mass death. Keep commerce moving. Prevent panic. Preserve legitimacy. Because in a city-state, legitimacy is not abstract. It is bread arriving on time. It is the market staying open. It is neighbors not turning into a mob. And here is the central question that will not let us go: what was this dancing? A spiritual attack? A poison in the grain? A neurological illness? A social breakdown? Or, most disturbing of all, was it a disaster made worse by policy, by people trying to solve a crisis while misreading what the crisis actually was? Because Strasbourg didn't simply witness the dancing. Strasbourg organized it. I want you to hold the scroll in your mind as if we are turning it under lamplight. The wax seal is cracked, not cleanly, but with those spiderweb fractures that happen when something has been forced open and pressed shut again. That alone tells you something: the order was handled, debated, perhaps resented. This is not theater. This is administration, cold ink trying to hold down hot fear. Strasbourg in AD 1518 is prosperous, and that prosperity is exactly why the threat feels existential. Dense streets mean rumor travels faster than carts. Crowded markets mean bodies close enough for fear to jump like a spark. Early modern life is a ledger of anxieties, the memory of plague, the expectation of famine, the constant negotiation between earthly authority and divine meaning. And over all of it, a religious pressure system building across Europe, reformist murmurs, accusations of corruption, the sense that God's judgment might not be metaphorical. Even if you don't name the Reformation yet, you can smell its tinder. The timeline comes to us through reports that behave like all reports under stress, vivid in some places, slippery in others. Accounts describe the dancing beginning with one woman, then growing, dozens, then more. Some later writers will say hundreds. Some will claim people danced for days, for weeks, until they dropped. Deaths are mentioned. How many? Here we must be disciplined. Numbers inflate when a story becomes a moral lesson, and this story is almost designed to become one. But the core holds across sources, sustained, compulsive dancing, spreading beyond one body, and provoking an official response. Something real happened, real enough that the city government put ink to parchment. So what does a government do when the enemy is not an army outside the walls, but a behavior inside the gates? They consult authorities. And one of the strangest, most revealing details is this: Strasbourg's council consults physicians, not only priests. That is an early modern signature, a city trying to be rational in a world where rationality is a contested border. The physicians, trained in humors, reportedly diagnose an excess of heat, hot blood. The body, in their model, is a system of balances. Too much heat, too much passion, too much internal fire, and the person becomes agitated, compelled. The proposed remedy follows their logic with brutal consistency: the sufferers must dance it out. Dance until the heat burns away. Dance until the imbalance resolves. Stop and feel the decision landing. Imagine you are a magistrate hearing this. You don't have germ theory. You don't have psychiatry as we would define it. You have precedent, doctrine, and the professional confidence of men who can explain the body with elegant diagrams and Latin terms. And you have a crowd outside that demands you do something. Indecision looks like weakness. Weakness invites disorder. Disorder invites rivals. So you reach for an action that has the blessing of learned medicine. But action is not always an antidote. Sometimes it is the accelerant. The policy becomes logistical. And logistics, more than ideology, is how you recognize a state. The city organizes spaces for dancing, platforms, musicians, supervision. Not because they enjoy the spectacle, but because a roaming swarm of dancers is a threat to doorways and workshops, to carts, to the narrow arteries of urban life. Concentrate it, they think. Contain it. Keep it from becoming a moving riot. This is crowd control dressed as therapy. But let's interrogate what that means in human terms. A platform in a public square is an invitation. It says, this is a recognized thing. This is an event. There is a place for it. There is music for it. There are witnesses. In a city where people interpret suffering through shared stories, visibility is not neutral. Visibility teaches the body what to do. Now the treatments compete, because in AD 1518 you do not have a single authority over illness. You have a marketplace of explanations, and each explanation carries a claim to power. Physicians prescribe regimen, cooling measures, perhaps bloodletting, purging, tools designed to restore balance by subtraction. You can hear the clink of bowls, see the dark thread of blood, smell the iron tang. Clergy prescribe prayer, confession, vows, processions. Relics are not decorations here, they are technology, devices for channeling the sacred. And then there is the old regional script, Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus is not an abstract saint in a book. In parts of Central Europe, St. Vitus dance already exists as a category of affliction, a known story about bodies that move against their will. That matters more than it sounds. Because when a population shares a narrative about what suffering looks like, the narrative can become a pathway. If you live in a world where saints punish and heal, where invisible forces have names and habits, then symptoms are not random. Symptoms are messages. And messages spread. So what are we looking at? Let's put the major explanations on the table like weapons, and test their edges. First, the supernatural, possession, saintly punishment, a spiritual attack. In AD 1518, this is not fringe. It is mainstream. It explains why people would take pilgrimage seriously, why they would vow offerings, why the clergy's voice could stabilize or destabilize a crowd. It also explains the moral texture of the fear. If you believe God is angry, then the dancing is not only dangerous, it is accusing. The weakness of this explanation, for us, is not that it is foolish, it is that it is not testable. And it can obscure the role of policy. If a saint is driving the outcome, then the council's decisions become footnotes. But the ordinance scroll insists the council mattered. Second, mass psychogenic illness, a collective stress response that spreads through observation, expectation, and fear. This explanation can sound dismissive if handled badly, as if people were pretending. They were not. Bodies can express terror, deprivation, and social pressure through movement, fainting, pain, convulsions, real suffering with no single pathogen. In this frame, the stage and the musicians are not treatment, they are a broadcast system. They turn private distress into public choreography. The strength of this perspective is that it explains spread. It explains clustering in one place and time. It explains why cultural scripts, St. Vitus, shape how the distress looks. The weakness is that it is difficult to prove in individuals 5 centuries later. And it risks turning a messy human crisis into a neat psychological label. Third, ergot poisoning. Rye fungus, ergot, can produce convulsions and hallucinations. It has a long, dark reputation in European history, because in wet years, in hungry years, people will eat compromised grain. And Strasbourg knows hungry years. Grain prices rise, the poor cut corners, bread becomes both sustenance and gamble. Ergotism can also produce a kind of visionary terror. So, it's tempting. It offers a biological villain you can point to. But the blade dulls when you press. Ergotism tends to cause painful vasoconstriction, burning sensations, sometimes gangrene, blackened extremities, screaming pain, along with spasms that are not neatly coordinated into days-long dancing. An ergot does not easily explain why the behavior follows a cultural script so cleanly, nor why official encouragement, music, stages, seems to matter. If ergot is the driver, the council's policy is almost irrelevant. Yet the records focus on policy. Fourth, a neurological disease, chorea, perhaps, movements that can be involuntary. This can explain individual cases. It struggles to explain a sudden clustered outbreak that seems to spread quickly through a population. Diseases do spread, of course. But this is not described like plague, where fever and sores march from house to house. This is described like a behavior, witnessed and repeated, shaped by expectation and fear. Now, before we decide anything, we have to look at the people who had to decide in real time. The magistrates are not cartoon villains. They are operators in a city that can fracture. Their options are all costly. Quarantine? That shocks the economy, invites anger, and is difficult to enforce without violence. Force? You can beat a dancer into stillness, perhaps, but then you risk turning the afflicted into martyrs, and the council into tyrants. Religious escalation? Processions and public penance can soothe, or they can intensify fear into hysteria. Medical compliance? Trust the physicians. Do the learned thing. The physicians, for their part, are not fools either. They are trapped in the best framework available to them. They do not have microscopes. They have patterns, categories, and a model of the body that has worked often enough to earn authority. But underneath all of this is the hidden conflict, the one that makes the ordinance scroll feel warm even after 5 centuries, legitimacy. If the council admits helplessness, order fractures. If they choose the wrong remedy, they become the author of casualties. This is not just about dancers. This is about who controls suffering, God, medicine, or the state. And in Strasbourg, those 3 powers are not allies. They are rivals forced into the same room. Now we reach the turning point, the decision that transforms a strange illness into a civic event. The council orders the building of stages and the hiring of musicians. Read that again in your mind as if you're reading it off the scroll: platforms, music, organized dancing. In war room terms, this is an attempt to channel an enemy force into a controlled zone. It is a containment strategy, like digging trenches. But the enemy here is not bacteria. It is suggestion, stress, exhaustion, and a cultural script that tells people what possession looks like. And the council has just given the script a stage. Picture the square. Boards hammered together. Splinters underfoot. A fiddler sawing at strings until resin dust mixes with sweat. Drums that thump like a second heart. Dancers stumbling, then catching the rhythm, then losing it again. Onlookers pressed in tight, faces shiny with heat, eyes wide with that mixture of horror and fascination that makes humans stare at wreckage. Guild leaders whisper about work not being done. Mothers pull children back, then lean forward again because they cannot look away. And every onlooker is a potential recruit, not because they want to join, but because the body is an instrument that can be played by stress and expectation. Ask yourself a question that matters more than any label we can attach. If you lived there, what would you think you were seeing? A curse? A punishment? A sickness that might climb into your own muscles next? Would you sleep that night? Or would you lie awake listening to distant music and wondering if your legs will betray you by morning? Now let's do cost accounting, because history is not only what happens, it is what it costs. Even if the death totals are uncertain, the costs are concrete. Bodies injured from relentless movement, swollen feet, torn skin, joints that grind. Collapses in the street, people carried like sacks. Labor lost, workshops silent, stalls unattended. Fear-driven decisions, families hiding afflicted relatives or dragging them to priests or physicians, spending money they do not have. And an ethical stain, treating agony like a public management problem, like something you can schedule and supervise. The moment the city hires musicians, suffering becomes organized, and organization can be cruelty even when it is meant as care. At some point, the response shifts. Sources suggest measures move toward religious remedies, pilgrimage, prayer, removal from public view. Perhaps the dancers are taken to a shrine associated with St. Vitus. Perhaps they're given time away from the square, away from the music, away from the watching eyes. And then, gradually, the outbreak fades. Now the debate sharpens, because the interpretation changes what we think worked. If it was saintly punishment, then pilgrimage and prayer are not placebo, they are the correct protocol. In that frame, the council's early reliance on physicians is not merely mistaken, it is politically dangerous, almost arrogant, treating divine anger as a medical imbalance. The remedy is submission. If it was ergot, then the stage policy is essentially irrelevant. The outbreak ends when the contaminated grain supply changes, when bodies metabolize the toxin, when the environmental condition shifts. In that frame, the council's stages and music are tragic nonsense performed alongside the real cause. The remedy is agricultural luck. If it was mass psychogenic illness, the picture becomes much sharper, and more uncomfortable for us. In that frame, the stage policy is gasoline. It broadcasts the behavior, validates it, and offers rhythm, a scaffold for the afflicted body. Pilgrimage and prayer work not necessarily because a saint intervenes, but because the afflicted are removed from the spectacle, given rest, given a new story about what will happen to them. The remedy is breaking the loop, changing attention, changing expectation, changing environment. So which explanation best fits the mechanism we can infer, the spread, the clustering, the role of public visibility? Ergot gives you biology but struggles with the choreography and the social pattern. Neurological disease explains individuals but not a sudden civic wave. Supernatural punishment explains meaning and response, but cannot account for why policy choices seem to shape the event's intensity. Mass psychogenic illness, anchored in stress, scarcity, and cultural script, fits the spread pattern and the sensitivity to attention. And crucially, it makes the ordinance scroll central. Because in this frame, governance is not background. Governance is part of the ecology of the outbreak. Here is the pattern beneath the chaos, and it is one you will recognize if you have ever watched leaders perform certainty under pressure. Overconfidence under uncertainty. A demand for decisive action because indecision looks like weakness. An urge to manage optics, to make the crisis look contained, even if containment changes the crisis itself. Strasbourg's council did not do nothing. They did something dramatic, visible, expensive, and official. And that something may have become part of the illness. There is a particular cruelty in that, but also a particular humanity. Because if you are a magistrate and you believe the physicians, you think you are authorizing relief. If you are a physician and you believe in hot blood, you think you are prescribing a purge through motion. If you are clergy and you believe St. Vitus is involved, you think you are navigating between punishment and mercy. Everyone believes they are acting against death. But the body does not negotiate with our intentions. It negotiates with stress, belief, heat, hunger, attention, and time. Now let's return to the square one more time, but listen differently. The music is not only sound. It is permission. It is instruction. It is a metronome that tells a trembling body how to move. The platform is not only wood. It is a declaration, this is real enough to build for. The crowd is not only witnesses. It is fuel. And this is why Strasbourg AD 1518 is not a medieval curiosity, not a bizarre footnote to be laughed at from a safe distance. It is a case study in institutions managing mass distress when the cause is unclear. The dancing is the symptom. The real story is governance under epistemic fog, decision-making when you cannot be sure what the enemy is. In that fog, the most dangerous impulse is the need to look in control. Because what Strasbourg built in the town square, we build today in different materials. In AD 1518, visibility is physical. You stand in a crowd, you watch a body convulse into rhythm, you feel fear in your own legs. Today, visibility is algorithmic. A feed can turn an isolated behavior into a pattern. Attention can act like a drumbeat. I am not saying the mechanisms are identical, history is not a cheap costume. But the rhyme is unmistakable. When distress becomes spectacle, it spreads differently. And then there is policy as an accelerator. Strasbourg's council didn't do nothing. They acted at scale. They made a decision that was coherent inside their worldview and disastrous inside the reality they were facing. That is the lesson that keeps returning across centuries. Well-meant interventions can intensify a problem when they misdiagnose the driver. If the driver is attention and stress, and you respond by amplifying attention, you have built a furnace and called it a hospital. Notice the competing authorities, too. Then, priest versus physician versus magistrate, each claiming the right to name what is happening. Now, institutions, experts, influencers, political actors, each fighting to define reality in public. Whoever controls the story controls the response, and sometimes, the symptoms. That is not cynicism. That is anatomy. So what does this teach, beyond fascination? In crises without clear causation, humility is strategy. Reduce spectacle. Protect the vulnerable. Avoid policies that turn suffering into public theater. And remember the oldest truth hidden in plain sight, the body is not only biology. It is also belief, stress, and environment negotiating in real time. We end where we began, with the ordinance scroll. Wax cracked. Edges worn. Not because it is famous, but because it was used, handled by men trying to keep a city from unraveling. Proof that a few council votes can change how fear moves through flesh. The verdict is simple and timeless. When you cannot name the cause of suffering, the story you choose, and the stage you build, can become part of the wound. Join the investigation. If you want the full dossier, what the sources actually say, which numbers are contested, and what we can responsibly claim without turning tragedy into myth, watch the next video that appears on the end screen, and keep the case open with me. Subscribe if you want these recovered memories turned into usable warnings, because every episode is a new file pulled from the archive with the same discipline, evidence first, certainty last. And here is the legacy question I want you to answer in the comments, not with facts, but with imagination. If you were a Strasbourg magistrate in AD 1518, no germ theory, a hungry population, rival authorities tugging at your sleeves, would you choose to suppress the dancers by force, hide them away in silence, or make the crisis visible and managed, even if that visibility might spread it?